which seems like a very momentous time to be having this event. And I'm glad that we could all get together. And I will present, hopefully for not too long, because I do want to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. Really, what I'm going to be focusing on today is the upcoming CUSMA renegotiations. I'm going to do a deep dive into that. We're going to look at different sectors. We're going to look at leverage, etc. For from a Canadian perspective, because this is the ASCM Western Canada branch. So we are going to take a Canadian perspective, and I am Canadian. So we will we'll take it from that sort of that way of looking at things. So just to make a start, I want to sort of really set the scene of where we are and who we're dealing with. And when I say we, I'm talking about Canada negotiating with the United States. And I kind of want to set the scene for what we have to look forward to.
One thing we're going to be demanding is we're going to be demanding respect from other nations. Canada, we have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We're not going to have that anymore. We can't do it. I don't know if it's good for them. As you probably know, I say you can always become a state. And if you're a state, we won't have a deficit. We won't have to tariff you, et cetera, et cetera. But Canada has been very tough to deal with over the years. And it's not fair that we should have a $200 billion or $250 billion deficit. We don't need them to make our cars, and they make a lot of them. We don't need their lumber because we have our own forests, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need their oil and gas. We have more than anybody.
So I guess the key thing there is when we're going into the CUSMA renegotiations, this is sort of the stance that the U.S. administration is going to be taking. We don't need Canada. We don't need their lumber. We don't need their cars. We don't need their oil and gas. We don't need Canada. We want, as the U.S., we want to become a self-sufficient nation, and we want to implement tariffs and protectionist measures as a way of achieving this this self-sufficiency. So some of the interesting things that have come out lately, we've also heard from Pete Hoekstra, who is the U.S. ambassador to Canada, is going to be heavily involved in the CUSMA negotiations. He's also taken the position, and he said it out loud in the news, that the U.S. does not need Canada. And he really sort of stressed the point that, the U.S. is just fine on its own, thanks, and we can carry on without Canada. Also, we've had, of course, on Friday, the big announcement of the U.S. Supreme Court that the IEEPA tariffs, so these are the tariffs, the across-the-board tariffs that were announced as part of Liberation Day, these were ruled illegal by the U.S. Supreme Court. And we're basically finding out now that Trump, and some of the comments that he made about his appointees to the U.S. Supreme Court, that he has taken this as a real blow, and he is not happy about it. His immediate reaction was to implement a 10% tariff on the entire world. And then I guess he found out that he could increase that by another 50%. So we put it up to 15%. And now we have this sort of 15% worldwide tariff that is in place for the next 150 days, at which time then Congress is going to have to vote on it. So one thing that has also come out, fortunately for Canadians, is that the 15% Section 122 tariffs, as they're called, are going to be anything that is traveling under CUSMA is going to be exempt from this additional 15% duty. But that means things that are outside of CUSMA and coming from other countries in the world are going to be hit now with this 15% tariff for the next 150 days. So quite a significant announcement. And I'll get into some of the other tariffs that we might see as a result of that announcement on Friday. Now, I would argue that Trump's position is, I guess, it's good from their perspective in terms of pursuing this idea of isolationism and protectionism. But the reality is that the U.S. does need Canada, and Canada does have several points of leverage, which I'll go through relatively quickly, because I really want to focus more on what happens next and what we can do throughout the negotiations. So kind of key points of leverage for Canada, of course, is that 50 to 60% of all crude oil imports into the United States actually come from Canada, the majority, of course, from Alberta. Why this matters, of course, is that we have established cross-border pipelines. We have an extensive rail and grid integration between the two countries. We have short transport distances, especially when you compare it to Venezuela, for instance. And we also have lower shipping costs than overseas oil. The other thing is that our Canadian oil is flowing directly into US Midwest refineries. These refineries, as well as the refining hubs in the Gulf Coast, have specifically been built for refining Canadian crude. So there's a huge established infrastructure around and billions of dollars invested in these refining facilities to process Canadian crude. And without Canadian crude, or with a very high tariff or tax on Canadian crude, the U.S. would actually feel the pinch very quickly at the pump, I should say. So the other thing why the US needs Canada is, of course, because the US consumes large amounts of critical minerals, but they produce, extract, process, etc., very little of their own critical minerals. Much of the upstream supply chain for critical minerals is controlled by China. China, in particular, has a stranglehold on the processing of critical minerals, whether that is lithium or uranium or cobalt. They have set up processing plants over the past 3-4 decades, and they've actually created an upstream stranglehold on processing of critical minerals across the board. And that really came into sharp focus when the US was threatening China. And China basically looked to say, well, we're just going to restrict the export of critical minerals into the States. And very quickly, Donald Trump had to back down from his position of threatening more and more tariffs on China. So Canada, where we sit, is in a nice position where we are developing or already have extraction capabilities for a lot of critical minerals: nickel, cobalt, lithium, of course, graphite, copper, and REEs, rare earth elements, as well as uranium. These rare earths are valuable, particularly because they go into things like lithium into EV batteries, but we also have cobalt going into semiconductors. We also have a lot of the rare earth elements go into missile defense systems. They go into weapon systems, a lot of which, of course, the US is, Lockheed Martin, et cetera, is responsible for manufacturing. And then you can see here, just on this map of Canada, that we hopefully you can see some of these, where these rare earth elements are located. We either have mines or we are looking to set up processing capacity. Sorry, I think I went past that a bit too quickly. Smelters or refineries, and looking to have some more advanced projects on the extraction for things like copper, nickel, zinc, etc. So a lot of rare earth opportunities, a lot of critical minerals opportunities, and guess what? China is very interested in Canada's critical minerals as well, especially because then they can handle the processing and their part of the supply chain. And that becomes a key point of leverage for Canada when we're negotiating with not only the US, but China, as well as the European Union, et cetera. So a couple of other things just to touch on why the US actually does need Canada is that we are a gateway to the Arctic. Of course, we have NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense and Command, which is sort of a joint US-Canada military system. Many of the most important radar surveillance installations are based in northern Canada or in Greenland, there's a lot of interest, of course, over the past month in Greenland and the US taking over Greenland. But of course, Canada holds a lot of those radar and detection systems as well. And we also have the capabilities to detect missile launches, long-range bombers, hypersonic threats, Arctic incursions. So having that, having Canada as a partner in NORAD is key to the security of not just Canada, but also to North America and the US in general. The other thing just to touch on about, being an Arctic gateway, of course, is that there's a lot of interest, not just from the States, but also from Russia, from China, in the Northwest Passage as the Arctic ice shelf is melting, opening up the potential for new shipping routes through the Northwest Passage. Just a couple of things just to show you what that actually looks like. You can see that the Northwest Passage does run along Alaska, but mostly along the northern border of Canada. And into Greenland. And then we also have what's called the Northern Sea Route that goes through Russia and then some of the Nordic countries. Why that's important is as this shipping lane begins to open up more and more, you can see here that there is a significant savings, about 1,900 nautical miles if you're sailing between the port of Rotterdam and the port of Vancouver or the port of Seattle. So for shipments coming from Europe into the west coast of North America, you can save about 4 to 5 days in transit time, assuming, of course, that the passage is ice-free at the time that you're shipping. At the moment, there's a fairly narrow window of when you can use the passage, but it is expected that it's going to open up. And there's been a lot of competition from nation states such as China and Russia to get control of those areas. The other big advantage is the Northern Sea Route. It's a major shortcut between Northern Europe and East Asia, cutting between 10 to 15 days versus having to traverse from, let's say, from China into Rotterdam via the Suez Canal. So the Northern Sea Route offers a significant reduction in transit times. And of course, there is a lot of interest from nation states in securing and owning those different passages. So where does that leave us? So we do have, as Canadians, there are sort of key points of leverage that we have. And I've only mentioned a few. There are a lot of other things around services and people-to-people trade, et cetera. But where are we in terms of, coming into the renegotiations of CUSMA now? So essentially, CUSMA has embedded in it is a joint review, mandatory in 2026, which is where we are now, where Canada, the US, and Mexico must decide whether to extend the agreement, to renegotiate, or to let it expire. So if all three parties agree, the three parties sit around the table, they look at CUSMA as it currently stands, they make a few tweaks here and there, then CUSMA can be extended for another 16 years, and the three parties can move off and sort of live happily ever after with a lot of certainty for businesses in terms of trade. Now, if the three parties don't agree, then what happens is a termination clock starts, where CUSMA goes into what's called a rolling annual review period, where each country can withdraw with 6 months notice. Okay, so if we don't get an agreement this year, this termination clock starts, and then year after year, it has to be constantly renegotiated between the three parties. All right, and then the other option, of course, is if a country withdraws, trade rules would then revert to WTO terms, or we would be trading under current, tariff rates for exports into the United States. And that would be where CUSMA would basically disintegrate, and we would move into sort of bilateral trade agreements. So if that does happen, there could be, significant tariffs on auto, softwood lumber. I also mentioned agriculture, new tariffs on a basket of farm products, of course, and we could also see additional, tariffs on energy, oil, et cetera, which I'm going to dive into this a little bit more. So just touching on this briefly as we get into the different options. So some of the things that we have to be aware of heading into the negotiations is that we have a US administration that basically thinks that it doesn't need Canada, that it is in the position of power, and it holds all of the cards. When you're dealing with the US administration, what's become very clear over the past year is Donald Trump, as well as his trade representatives, so Pete Hoekstra, as well as some of the other members of his negotiating team, really look at any type of trade agreement as a transaction, as a business transaction, and also as a poker game. So when they talk about Canada not having any cards, the US having all of the cards, they're literally looking at it as a game of poker, and whoever has the most cards or the best cards wins. So trade and entering into negotiations with the United States is not about collaboration. It's not about trust building. It's not about having this idea of long-term partnerships. It's about whoever has the best hand wins. So we have to keep that in mind. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up here is there's a range of trade irritants. Some of the biggest ones have just been recent, and one of them has been, I think, very personal, especially to Donald Trump. And that is, of course, of Mark Carney and his Davos speech, which really has rang out across the world. If you've been following the media, that really, and the standing ovation that he had following the speech, has really sort of set the stage for how the world is changing. And in my opinion, I think it really hit the nail on the head. That rules-based trade as we know it has been an illusion, but that illusion has now been smashed. The idea that there was this rules-based trading system, it allowed economies, it allowed governments to function, it allowed trade to happen. And now we're living in a world where rules-based trade has come to an end because of the US administration's approach to trade. And now we're living in this era of strong men and great powers, hegemons, who are basically in control of the world and its resources, and all of the other countries outside of China, the United States, and arguably Russia, are basically just pawns in a game of strong men. And essentially, we heard from Mark Carney that there's a call for middle powers that must act together and trade together or risk being dominated by these global hegemons. That speech was not well received by the US administration. There was an interview with the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, following the speech. And just at the bottom, he just said, I'd just encourage PM Carney to do what he thinks is best for Canadian people, not for virtue signaling, because we do have a USMCA trade agreement coming up. So he was basically saying, hey, rein it in, Carney. We are going to be negotiating, and you don't need to be scoring any of your own goals and upsetting President Trump on the lead up to these negotiations. So that is a trade irritant, and I do believe it is still ringing in the ears of President Trump. The other thing is, of course, we have Canada and China signed a preliminary trade agreement. This is not a free trade agreement, and I should stress that, because free trade agreements are not allowed under CUSMA between Canada and other countries. So we have a preliminary trade agreement that was signed between Carney and Xi. And essentially, as most of you probably know, that is going to reduce the tariffs on Chinese EVs from 100% down to 6%, and it's going to allow a quota of about 49,000 vehicles into Canada, which is around 2.5% to 3% of annual vehicle sales. Also, China has agreed to cut tariffs on Canadian canola oil from 85% down to 15%. And then they're also suspending tariffs on things like lobster, crab, peas, and other agricultural exports. Now, that is all well and fine for Canada and China, but let's just say that the US is not happy about it, in particular Trump. The US's policy is to isolate China. It does not want China to be going out and securing trade agreements like it is at the moment with the UK, with the European Union, and with Canada. Its biggest concern of the US administration is Canada now acting as a backdoor for Chinese goods. So what that basically looks like is you can have Chinese firms as part of this, reduction in tariffs on Chinese EVs, having Chinese companies setting up EV plants in, let's say in Windsor in Ontario, and making, let's say, 100% Canadian content, and then shipping that down, or even 80% or whatever it is, sending that content down into the United States. And that then is qualified under CUSMA. And the US is basically saying, well, hey, you can't do that. That is still a Chinese-owned facility. And as such, you're basically allowing Chinese goods into the United States through the back door of Canada. So there's a lot of frustration by the US administration around the EV picture. And you can just see here, these are just some examples of Chinese shipments coming into Canada and then going down by various routes into the United States. And the US administration is really seeing that as a trade irritant heading into the CUSMA negotiations. And that can go through auto supply chains, it can go through energy supply chains in various modes and methods as we begin to integrate Chinese components and parts into products and components going down to the States. So The other thing is just to be aware of is that there's the Canadian dairy supply management, which is a real bugbear for Trump. He's mentioned it over and over and over again, saying, there's 200 to 250% tariffs on Canadian goods and on dairy, et cetera. And there's a little bit of truth in that, but not a total amount of truth as usual. Basically, we have the supply management system, which allows tariff-free imports of U.S. dairy of up to about 3.6% of imports of Canada's total dairy market into Canada from outside countries. There is low or very, very limited tariffs inside of that quota, but over that quota, it's about 200 up to 300% outside of in addition to that quota. Now, so Trump is right to some extent that, once we go above that quota, that these big, high, hefty tariffs do kick in. However, the reality is, since CUSMA has come into place, the U.S. has never exceeded that that quota. So they actually have never had to pay that 250% tariff. So that's really kind of it's neither here nor there. The other reality is that only about 40 to 60% of available U.S. dairy access is actually being used across the various dairy categories. So that's cheese or butter or milk, et cetera. So when Trump is saying that we have this huge trade irritant around the supply management system, the reality is they're not really using the quota at the moment, and nor are they exceeding that quota. The other thing, of course, is softwood lumber, a particular concern to the BC economy. And one of the interesting things about softwood lumber is that it's actually not part of CUSMA and is not governed by a permanent trade agreement. Softwood lumber, anybody who's been living in BC for a long time knows it's been a constant issue between Canada and the United States, and Canada has been hauled in front of the WTO a number of times as a result of not just from the US, but from France as well. And we've had a lot of kickback on softwood lumber. The U.S. has really reacted by putting in place countervailing and anti-dumping duties, arguing that because some of the lumber is taken from Crown land, and that we are setting the stumpage fees for that lumber. That is essentially subsidized by the Canadian government, and as such, they can implement these anti-dumping duties. So at the moment, we have the softwood lumber agreement that is managing the shipment of softwood lumber into the States, and that was expired in 2015. Since then, trade has reverted to tariffs, so very high tariffs actually. So there's the 10% sectoral specific tariff, but there's also another 35% anti-dumping duty that is being imposed on softwood lumber. So we have sort of tariffs on softwood lumber and timber going into the States of between 35 to 45%. So it is quite high. The US at the moment is facing high home building costs, as we are in Canada, and shortages of timber. So this is a big issue and a big concern for them. And Trump has mentioned jacking up those tariffs even higher a number of times over the past year. And then Canadian lumber supplies roughly 25 to 30% of US softwood consumption. So it's a significant part of their market. And they do require our imports in order to continue construction at the pace that they are at the moment. The other thing is just, of course, the auto sector. I think everybody here would be aware that we have a heavily integrated auto supply chain between Canada and the US. But I think kind of the key things that the US is irritated by by the Canadian automotive sector is that they keep making this argument about high trade deficits, meaning that they import a lot more components and finished goods than they export. And for whatever reason, the Trump administration really doesn't like trade deficits, even though it runs counter to a lot of economic arguments. That's their position. We also have this argument that too much of automotive production, whether that's components or finished assembly, has shifted from the United States to Mexico and to Canada. There are rules of origin clauses within CUSMA that are not strict enough for the United States, and they're very difficult to enforce. I'll just mention a couple of them here. Understanding the content rules of especially for components. So everything, it's supposed to be 75% North American content, but it's very hard to deem what part of a component is Canadian, or when you get into things like the raw materials and the component parts that go into things like a transmission, it becomes very hard to break down those content requirements. You also have things called labor value content rules, steel and aluminum that go into these components as well. Where is that coming from? Where is it refined? Because some of that can be done in Canada, some can be done in the States. You can also have the inputs into aluminum, for instance, coming from like bauxite coming from Brazil. So it can become very complicated when you're trying to establish these different sources. CUSMA is not really clear on what to do with critical minerals for electric vehicles and EV batteries. And as I said earlier, a lot of the processing for the critical minerals that go into EV batteries, things like lithium in particular, come from outside of North America, i.e. China. So there are some things that are up in the air and due for renegotiation that are going to be an irritant for the United States. I think what I want to get into now, though, is I'm going to come up with 4 scenarios of where I think the negotiations are heading. One thing that I would say, of course, is I'm kind of looking at the Canadian, let's say the Canadian sector as a whole. And I know people here are representing all different types of industries. When you're doing as a business, so I've done this type of risk and scenario planning with businesses before. I actually did it during Brexit when I was living in the UK. I did a lot of risk planning with the UK government, with the Department of Business and Trade. And what they were interested in is looking, especially during COVID. So I lived there for 20 years, but from 2020 into 2024, 25, I did a lot of scenario plannings with the government there, and as well as with UK businesses. And essentially, what came out of that is, how do companies do risk planning, and how do they prepare for what's called the worst case scenario? One of the interesting things that came out of my research into preparing for Brexit is that when I was interviewing pharmaceutical companies, so I did interviews with GSK, AstraZeneca, as well as with Pfizer. And when I was talking to the big multinationals, they were doing a similar exercise that I'm going to show you now. And what GSK says is, well, what we do is we plan for a full exit of the European Union. So there's going to be no single market. There's going to be no customs union. The UK is going to come out of that completely. And we are going to plan for that worst case. So when I was interviewing these companies, this was back in 2016, 2017, they were basically saying that we're not going to wait for the UK government and the European government to come up with an agreement. We're going to plan for the worst case. We're going to invest money based on the worst case. And then we can move into the treating this risk of Brexit as more like a daily operational issue. So by planning for the worst case, so again, dropping out of the single market, dropping out of the customs union with Europe, the GSK basically said, well, we're going to invest in a new facility in Europe. We are going to bring our inputs into our pharmaceuticals into Europe and into the UK. So it's going to cost us about $60 million. So they literally invested $60 million based on this worst case outcome, which is nice for them because they were able to afford it. They made that investment, but as soon as they had committed to the worst case, the uncertainty disappeared, right? They were planning for the worst case outcome, and anything else would be better than that, right? And the idea is that they made that investment to remove the uncertainty. And if anybody's familiar with Brexit, it went on for about 4 years of we're doing this and we're doing that and arguing. But GSK just continued on like it was just an operational issue because they planned for the worst case outcome. And that's what I want to really get into now. So with this risk planning, you can see here, this is just what's called a 5x5 matrix. You can see along the top is the impact of the outcome. So it's the potential severity of the risk consequence. So when we're talking about, of course, CUSMA renegotiations, I'm going to put forward 4 different scenarios, and I'm going to try to plot it along here. You can see at the top, again, is impact. And then along the left-hand side is the probability about how likely that risk or that outcome is likely to occur. So what is the probability? And basically the matrix just says the probability times the impact is the risk level that you're dealing with as a company. So this is a common tool that's used in a lot of businesses. I think it's really useful for small and medium-sized businesses. More difficult, obviously, for SMEs to plan for worst case outcomes, because you can't invest $60 million in a new facility in the States, for instance, because the money's just not there, and I get that. But it does allow you to deal in the real world of worst case outcomes, and I think that's really important for businesses. So the first sort of scenario that I thought about was CUSMA remaining largely intact with some small tweaks to tariff rates. So when we get to 2027 and the negotiations have gone through, we have three parties that have gotten together. They've looked at the agreement. They have negotiated based on a shared understanding that a 16-year agreement would remove uncertainty for North American businesses, and it's in the best interest of all three countries. So let's just make it work and let's push it forward. The dairy supply management quotas would likely have to remain intact for it to be a small tweak. We would also have to see softwood lumber remaining outside of the scope of CUSMA. Otherwise, CUSMA then would be considered to be significantly renegotiated. And in this scenario, you would have the North American trading bloc, Mexico, Canada, and the US would have the ability to then be a combined trading bloc that could negotiate with the European Union. It can negotiate with the Asian nations. It would give us leverage in terms of, especially for Canada and Mexico, by having that access to the US market. And it would give us sort of stronger leverage when we move into future negotiations. Now, if this was with a different US administration, I think that this would be a likely outcome, because it's sensible. It benefits most of the companies and businesses involved who have been operating and have built supply chains around CUSMA. And I think it would make a lot of sense if we were not dealing with the Trump administration. However, we are. So we have to live in the real world, as Carney said during his Davos speech. So where I put scenario one is basically unlikely and I was between very unlikely and unlikely that there's only going to be small tweaks and that the agreement is going to go through with little to no changes. So that is, if it did go through, then overall, and again, I'm having to draw generalizations here. If you're a business doing this, of course, you're looking at your own business and your own supply chain. And what you need to do is do this risk scenario planning with the senior management team. You want representatives from operations, from supply chain, from procurement, from sales, from marketing, finance, and accounting, all sitting around the table and coming up with where you think your business is how your business is going to be impacted, as well as a consensus around the probability of this happening. I'm doing this exercise from a helicopter position from Canada, as a overall nation to nation sort of negotiation. So take this with a pinch of salt. It's more to show businesses how to do it and what to do afterwards. So scenario two, for me, is this idea where CUSMA is significantly renegotiated, but it does survive. It's going to be battered and bruised as it comes out the other side. But in the end, it is negotiated by the end of 2026 and is extended for a further 16 years. Now, in order for that to happen, what I'm going to predict, and I don't think it's too crazy, these predictions, but Trump and Hoekstra are going to continue to threaten withdrawal of CUSMA, and I would expect this to be a relatively regular type of threat. We're going to hear more and more of this. We don't need Canada. We don't need their dairy. We don't need their autos. We don't need their lumber. This is going to continue to happen for the rest of the year. I also think Trump is going to push and or force Canada to break the recent EV agreements with China. I really do not believe that the US administration is happy about us making concessions on EVs. They really have an issue with this, Canada acting as a backdoor into the United States. And I also believe that because they still have 100% tariff on their auto market, they're not going to be willing to make, especially the big three automakers, they like that level of protection. They're not going to be happy about trading with Canada under these reduced tariffs on EVs. So if we are going to survive, I do expect a lot of pushback on the Canada-China trade negotiations. I think the other thing is Trump is going to implement additional sector product-specific tariffs as leverage, particularly on automotive, steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber. We've seen how casually he just throws tariffs here and there. And I do appreciate that the Supreme Court has ruled against those IEEPA tariffs, which I'll come on to in a second. But there are other tariff weapons, tools, let's call them, at his disposal that he can and probably will use. So we have to be aware that this is going to continue to happen. So here's sort of where we are at the moment. Now, this is basically a summary of active tariffs on Canadian goods. This is as of today. So what I've done is I've stripped out those IEEPA tariffs. So those IEEPA tariffs, again, are the ones that are countrywide and were applied to all of Canada imports into the United States. The Supreme Court overturned only the IEEPA tariffs, and that's important because we still have in place sectoral specific tariffs called the Sector 232 tariffs that are implemented on national security basis. So a Sector 232 tariff is basically a tariff that the U.S. can implement, and they should do it with the approval of Congress, but they don't always. Is that the 232 tariff is basically protects strategically important industries from dumping of external products into the market on national security concerns. So we've seen those 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, which are now at 50%. We've just seen a recent tariff on copper, semi-finished copper. We also have finished autos at 25%. These, again, are 232 tariffs. We have a 25% on heavy-duty trucks. We have 25% on furniture and cabinets. And we also have the 10%, the 232 tariff on softwood lumber. Those are all active as of today. And I expect if CUSMA is going to come out the other end in one piece, that we're going to see additional 232 tariffs. I do typically, when you are trying to implement a 232 tariff, it should go through Congress and it should have a period of actually doing an investigation into it. Usually that's around a year to a year and a half. That doesn't always happen. What I think Trump will probably do is just implement them and hope for the best. And then once CUSMA is actually agreed, then he'll go from there. So there's another type of tariff called a Section 301 tariff. These are actually been applied by the U.S. against China since 2016, since Trump's first term. And those are basically done according to unfair trading practices. So again, it's dumping, it's countries subsidizing particular types of goods, like let's say EVs. And they can deem that particular trading practice as unfair, and then they've implemented 301 tariffs against a lot of Chinese products. So we could see 232 tariffs and 301 tariffs coming through from the U.S. administration throughout the CUSMA negotiations. I would expect to see more of these, unfortunately. The 15% tariffs that Trump had just announced, was it Saturday, I think, or Friday night? Those are only valid, like I said earlier, for 150 days. And then, in theory, Congress has to vote on whether to continue those tariffs. We have to remember that the U.S. Congress, of course, is, you have the House and the Senate are both Republican. So in theory, they should pass it, but who knows? There's a lot of pushback by their constituents. And the other thing I would say is that the 15% tariff at the moment does not apply to CUSMA goods. So that's a benefit to Canada. So where I kind of put, some of the other things I should say about the second scenario to get CUSMA through is that we're going to have to, as a Canadian concern, have to make concessions on content requirements for North American product. The U.S. is going to really push for more domicile production, so reshoring, onshoring of U.S. production wherever possible. We're also going to be having to look at this stricter wage threshold that is really targeted at Mexico, but it can apply to Canada as well. They're really going to be pushing back on any Chinese-linked inputs and components going from Canada into the United States, especially if Chinese companies are able to set up facilities in Canada. Again, that's the transshipment of non-North American content and avoiding that backdoor. The other thing is, if we are going to get to the other side of CUSMA, they're going to have to make concessions on dairy supply management. I really don't believe the Trump administration is going to give up on this one very easily. And they're going to have to adjust these supply management quotas. And I think those quotas would have to go up. And then the tariffs on anything below or above quota, I believe, would have to be decreased. So I think that's going to have to happen in order for CUSMA to come out the other side. The other thing I would suspect is that softwood lumber will be added into the CUSMA negotiations and become part of the agreement in order for CUSMA to sort of come out the other side intact. And the U.S. is going to still want, I believe, tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber using these sectoral specific tariffs, the 232 tariffs. Okay, so scenario 2, in my opinion, where I put it is at moderate in terms of how probable it is. But of course, the impact is going to be significant because, like I said, the automotive sector will be impacted, softwood lumber, timber, all of the industries connected to dairy, to the dairy supply management will be affected. And it will have an impact on steel, aluminum. We are going to see a major disruption, in my opinion, to Canadian supply chains, whether you're a small business that supplies into these industries, or you are one of the large multinationals that are large Canadian-based firms, I should say, that are involved in these particular sectors. So I'm sort of putting that at a moderate to and moderate likelihood, and then a significant impact on the supply chain. The other thing, scenario 3, which is basically where CUSMA is not agreed this year. We failed to reach an agreement in 2026, and we move into this perpetual or permanent renegotiation cycle. In my opinion, that this is likely, unfortunately, because I believe the U.S. is going to push for way too many and too severe concessions from Canada as well as from Mexico. I don't believe that Canada is going to be willing to provide the U.S. with the concessions that they're going to be looking for on the supply management, on softwood lumber, automotive, as well as the breaking up of the Canada-China EV agreement. So I do think that this is looking, in my opinion, as quite a likely outcome because of the way that Trump negotiates. It's basically, let's kind of push for everything that we want. And we will, if we're given anything, then we'll just ask for more. And I don't believe that the Carney government is going to be willing or even able to give away as much as Trump is going to be looking for. We also, the clock is ticking here, we're not very far along in the negotiations. I know the U.S. is negotiating with Mexico currently, and there's some behind the scenes chatter going on between the Canadian and U.S. negotiations, but there doesn't seem to be too far along as far as I can see in the media. The other thing that I would say is moving into this perpetual cycle of renegotiation is actually really beneficial for the United States, because every year, not just in 2026, but in 2027, 2028, they can ask for more and more and more trade concessions, which is great for Donald Trump because he doesn't really care about the uncertainty it creates. He lives in a world of uncertainty, as we've seen over the past year. And it really benefits the U.S. Trading position because they can continue to ask for more and more concessions every year from Canada and Mexico until they get what they want. So this creates a high degree of uncertainty for Canadian and U.S. businesses. So where I actually put this is likely, again, because it fits well with the U.S. administration's approach to negotiations. They have all the cards. They want to basically break their opponent, and they want to get everything possible. Whereas Canada and Mexico are not going to be able to make all of the concessions that the U.S. is looking for. So I put that here as, you know, a 4x4. So likely with a major impact, of course, if for all Canadian businesses, because then we don't have CUSMA negotiate, we don't have CUSMA, and businesses have to then go into year-by-year planning, which of course is extremely expensive and a lot of uncertainty. The last scenario, and I'm conscious of time, I want to leave time for questions and answers, is the complete dissolution of CUSMA due to the US withdrawal. And unfortunately, I have to say that this is fairly likely as well, based on what the US has been signaling. And I do know that Trump makes these grand statements and then has to kind of rein himself in. But I do think it does also fit with their trade policy of protectionism, about making America great again by bringing manufacturing to the States, high tariffs, and continuing to push this. We don't need Canada, we don't need the rest of the world type of agenda. So there's already been statements of Trump weighing quitting the USMCA altogether. We are seeing this idea of moving to a separate bilateral trade agreement. So if CUSMA does fall apart, we will then have a Canada-US trade agreement, and we will have a Mexico-US trade agreement, but that might take 1, 2, 3 years to negotiate. So that will be up in the air. This fits well, like I said, with this idea of self-sufficiency and using tariffs to reshore manufacturing. It would lead to sector-specific negotiations and new and additional tariffs, in my opinion, and quotas on those sectors. We're already seeing US-Mexico direct trade talks underway. Canada has sent their trade delegation, was it last week, I believe, to Mexico. And Carney, of course, is really trying to diversify away from the States by 2035. He wants to double non-US exports. So where did I put this? I actually put it as likely and severe. Of course, if we don't have CUSMA anymore, the ramifications for the Canadian economy would be very severe, and from not just forestry and automotive, but across all small and medium-sized businesses and services as well, would have a very severe impact for quite obvious reasons. So what does that mean? If we look at this, if I just sort of plot all of these 4 scenarios here, if you're a business, and if I wasn't an academic and I was in business like I used to be, I would be very concerned about scenario 3 and scenario 4, and I would be really looking at worst case scenario planning based on scenario 3 and scenario 4 outcomes. So what we can do as a country sort of moving forward, and then I'll come into what businesses can do. Our only option as a country is to continue building a stronger deck of cards. Again, so we got to get really good at playing poker with the Trump administration. In my opinion, I believe we should double down on deepening trade ties with China, and use that again as leverage as throughout the CUSMA negotiations. I also think we should have stronger ties with Mexico. And I know, like I said, there was a trade delegation went to Mexico last week with Canadian businesses. Focus on trade diversification. I do have to say I admire the Carney government's really active push around trade diversification. Is sort of what I've been advocating for and calling for. And he's really taken the bull by the horns there, not with just China, but also Qatar, Indonesia, the Asian nations. And that needs to continue to become less and less dependent on the United States. Also, of course, there's the big energy infrastructure investments from the Carney government, and I also welcome that, to continue to look at LNG and gas exports to Asian countries as well as China. The other thing that has been interesting following the Davos speech is the push by the Carney government for building this middle powers trading coalition. And this is sort of general, but I really would encourage the Carney government to kind of pursue this as much as possible. And this is this middle powers coalition between European Union countries and members of the CPTPP, and I'll show you who those are in a second, and other sort of middle countries, not the hegemons, but actually forming a coalition where we're stronger together in the middle. And some of the countries that have been discussed would be EU members: Mexico, Vietnam, Singapore, Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and really building this coalition of middle powers to counteract the global hegemons. And I believe that is really important going forward. That market, that EU plus CPTPP, is about 1.5 billion people. So you're up there with the Chinese market itself, and 1/3 of global GDP. So that's where I would call for further investment and effort by the Carney government to build that middle power coalition. I think the thing for Canadian businesses, like I've talked about so far, is this idea of worst case scenario planning for high likelihoods, high severity outcomes. Your scenario one and scenario two, I think most businesses are already thinking about that planning for it, but I think we have to be realistic about the world that we live in, and the Trump administration that we're dealing with is scenario three, which is a risk factor of 16, is our 4 times 4, and our scenario four, which is a risk factor of 20, again, which is a likely times very severe outcome, and businesses have to basically plan around that. So with this worst case scenario planning, what you need to do is you have to create an end-to-end supply chain map of your North American supply chain. Included in that would be any raw materials that are sourced within North America, any intermediary parts, who the suppliers are, where the suppliers are located, any finished goods, and any sort of customers and end users within North America, as well as any cross-border transit points. And that should be sort of captured in this supply chain map. I just provided actually an example of what I did with the UK government in supply chain mapping. I don't have enough time to go through all of this. But basically what it says is that you have your tiers of your supply chain. Tier 0 is, and this is actually a lithium ion battery map, but here it basically shows that the flow is coming from the bottom going to the top. So the flow of goods is going up from your tier 4. So this could be your raw materials. This could be your processing in tier 3. Tier 2 would be your component suppliers. Tier 1 would be your final assembly, and tier 0 would be your would be going into your customer or to your distribution facility. On the right, why I really like this map is it actually shows all of the countries and the key companies that are involved in the supply chain. And you can see the color coding that the UK government did here shows where the countries sit and the key points of involvement in the supply chain that they have. So this is a really good way to start with this worst case scenario planning. You have to know, you have to have visibility of your North American supply chain before you can do worst case scenario planning. The other thing is just getting into this, of course, we need to allocate financial and human resources to this planning and modeling. I think, of course, you want a team of experienced people, 5-6 people that are going to be carrying out this exercise. Of course, procurement, logistics, operations, supply chain people are obvious. You want to bring finance into it, of course, if there's any investments necessary. Sales and marketing doesn't always seem obvious, but they need to be involved too because of their market knowledge and if we need to open up new markets. And then finally, step 3, we want to use supply chain modeling software or digital twins, if you have the deep pockets to afford it, to test that supply chain burst based on these worst case outcomes. And any new tariff shocks or costs that might arise for your business in 2027 and beyond. I've just put down a couple of supply chain modeling software that are out there on the market. IBM Planning Analytics is really good. Blue Yonder has a package. Oracle SCM Cloud. I don't work for any of these companies, by the way, so take it with a grain of salt. But they are established and they do have quite detailed supply chain planning software that you can use. And then FourKites is the other option there. So those are some areas that you can look into for modeling and actually looking at how these scenarios would play out in your supply chain. I think finally is revising your current supply chain and go-to-market strategies based on these worst case outcomes. So really taking the worst case as, this is what's going to happen and changing your strategy, your supply chain strategy, or go-to-market strategy accordingly. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, I'll just say this, brace yourself. I think it's really going to get ugly over the next year. Hang in there and I'll do what I can to help. So I'll just open it up for questions and thanks everybody.
Okay, so we do have 2 or 3 questions. I'll go to Heather's question first. So based on this, would PM Carney be working on a worst case scenario risk like your scenario 4?
Yes. So I think, Heather, when you're doing the scenario planning, it can work for businesses as well as for governments. And what I would say is that Carney, if he's not, he should be doing worst case scenario planning according to that worst case outcome of CUSMA actually falling apart because of the U.S. withdrawal and beginning to invest and make decisions accordingly. And I think that's important. I think he's already doing a lot of that in terms of diversification, new trade agreements with outside countries. But there would also have to be an element of assistance, financial assistance for Canadian businesses if we were to drop out of CUSMA. And I do think there should be a contingency fund, some money set up, and that could be tariff money that's been accumulated or other pot of money to support businesses if we do see the CUSMA disintegrate.
Right. Thanks, Heather, for that question. Jennifer, many of my clients are cosmetics that fall under CUSMA, but fall afoul of Section 232 of the aluminum steel tariff for the packaging. Will the 15% new tariff be added to that aluminum steel tariff on the aluminum steel containing packaging portion?
Okay, that's a great question, Jennifer. And you're looking at one of these, well, there are many of these sort of nuances and gray areas of trade. I would say in this particular instance, the aluminum steel tariff for the packaging, I believe that if they're CUSMA compliant for the cosmetics, they're not going to be seeing the 15% tariff being added on for the aluminum and steel. They would be able to trade under the CUSMA agreement and not have to pay that 15% tariff. A lot of that is around sort of the declaration, of course, and how they do the harmonized system declarations. But in that particular instance, with this new 15% tariff, I think they'll be able to get around that because they're CUSMA compliant at the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. Deep Patel, what are your thoughts on Canada offshoring its manufacturing operations to access cheaper labor and how this affects the country's trade balance by increasing the outflow of manufactured goods in order to survive in North America?
That's a great question. This really comes back to where supply chains came from in the first place. Deep Patel, I think the offshoring and manufacturing to access cheap labor is why we have supply chains in the first place. Canadian companies, U.S. companies have been, North American companies have been doing it since the 1960s. I think that is the world that we live in, and I don't think we're able to accept it. I don't believe in this whole idea of trade deficits. I believe that when we have countries that are good at particular things and they trade with other countries that are good at particular things, and both countries benefit. I don't see trade as a deficit, nor do most economists, which is why Trump's argument around trade deficits have been basically debunked by so many economists. And I think the issue here is this idea of Canada, where our strengths are, is around, of course, raw materials, critical minerals, energy, automotive. But we're seeing more and more as Canada's trying to move up the value chain to do things that are more complex and capture more of the value of their supply chain here at home by doing things with our highly educated population. We're really good in services as AI is becoming very, very prevalent in Canada as well. And I believe what's more important is capturing value in the higher end of the supply chain, and as an economy that benefits Canada versus trying to chase this race to the bottom of cheap labor. So I don't think that is overall effective.
Okay, and Jennifer quickly responded back, packaging is aluminum tubes or stainless steel springs inside the plastic bumps, but the portion of those metal components is being tariffed currently at the 50% rate. Okay,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
now, sorry, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just think portion of those metal components. So I think if they're currently being tariffed at the 50%, with the 15%, that's a really tricky one, Jennifer, because the 15% is not being applied to CUSMA products, and I can see why this one's up in the air for you and your customer. In my opinion, I don't think they're going to have to pay it, but that is going to be up in the air. The other thing I would also say is that 15% is only going to be in place for about 150 days. If I was your customer, I would look at a bonded facility. I would look at doing some storage for the next 3 or 4 months, wherever possible, and then shipping products in if they do believe they're going to be hit with that 15% tariff. There are other ways to kind of get around it if they're concerned of that extra 15% coming into play. So I think maybe speaking with a customs broker or a bonding agency might be a way forward, because there is going to be this 150-day sort of time limit around these tariffs. That might be one way to get around it.
Okay, thank you. And Sophie has a question. If Canada is going to have more trade with Asia, does the Port of Vancouver have enough capacity to facilitate the increase of imports and exports?
I think at the moment, yeah. So, Sophie, I think obviously I see this as a huge opportunity for the Port of Vancouver. Obviously, Port of Vancouver already is the largest port in Canada. It is operating at between 75 to 80% capacity on most days. And there is obviously room for expansion. I believe that as we begin to increase trade with Asia, a lot of that's going to come from energy first, from LNG, and it's going to come from oil and gas in terms of sort of value amounts. And that's not necessarily all going to go through the port. It can come through other ports up north. But then we are going to see, as the diversification continues, it'll be in goods, et cetera. And I do believe that the port does have the capacity to handle that over a period of years, and we'll be able to expand to meet that need. And I really just see it as a huge business opportunity for the Port of Vancouver and for the BC government as well, going forward. So I think this diversification, BC, Vancouver is the gateway to the Asian. And I really believe that we have a really sort of fruitful opportunity over the next sort of decade with trade.
Okay, and then Lee has a question. Will the duties paid on IEPA be reimbursed? Will the surtax duties on Canada be eligible for duty drawback?
Okay, so Lee, I hope that's the correct pronunciation. The one about the duties that have already been paid on IEPA, again, most of that has been paid by American businesses. So the question is really going to be, I believe, is how long will the litigation take for these U.S. companies that go against how long will it take for the U.S. companies to basically litigate against the U.S. government to get this money back? And honestly, it could be years. I don't believe that you're going to see the U.S. government taking that almost $200 billion in tariff revenue and dispersing it back to U.S. companies or to U.S. consumers unless they're forced to by the lower courts in the United States. And that could take years of litigation of companies and individuals going after that money from the U.S. government. So I would not expect to see any of that money. If there's been any cost sharing agreements with a Canadian company and a U.S. counterpart, I also don't believe that the Canadian companies are going to see that money anytime soon, because of course the American companies would have to get reimbursed first, and then that money passed on to the Canadian companies. So you mentioned the surtax duties on Canada be eligible for duty drawback. So I believe, are you referring to imports of product into Canada from the States? I'm not quite sure which area you're referring to there. Is that sort of the counter tariffs that Canada put in place? I'd have to get a little bit more information on what you're looking for there to understand about the duty drawbacks.
Lee says both ways.
Both ways. Okay. So I would say that the surtax duties on Canada be eligible for duty drawbacks? Yes and yes, but I say that with a big but. Again, this is going to have to go through the courts in the United States, probably as well as through Canada for imports into Canada. And I would not expect for businesses to see any of this money for at least a year to 2 years for all of this to kind of work through that system, because the U.S. Treasury is not going to be in any hurry to hand that money back, from what I'm hearing from the U.S. Pundits at the moment. So I don't believe, even though Canadian companies might be eligible for duty drawback, that they're going to actually physically see any money for quite a long period of time. And Jennifer, I am sorry that that's a real gray area. I would sort of, if I was the company, plan for the worst case, and look at the potential of stacking and make contingencies around that. I think that's sort of the best that your business can do until we get more clarity from the U.S. government on stacking of duties, etc.
Okay, and Jennifer's put a link. I found this non-stacking for section 232. So there's a link in the chat.
Okay, cool. I'll take a look at
Um,
that.
and then I think Lee still has his hand up. He's got another question. I think he wants to come on, Mike,
No, I
actually.
was actually going to just say to Jennifer, because I've had a similar situation with the products in my company, which is that if steel is part of the product, as long as it's less steel than the product, you only declare the actual product itself and you don't need to mention steel as part of the tariff code. And if you do that, and I've had my broker confirm that you're allowed to, you don't declare the steel component because it's just packaging. We use in my company steel as a structural support for the products that we're making, and we just declare it as the main item, and that's perfectly legal, and it doesn't actually register any of the 232 tariffs.
So it may be good to check with a broker then, right, Lee?
So you should check with the broker.
Yeah.
100%. You can look at any compliance broker; they'll tell you you're legally allowed to do that. It just has to be like in my case, it's wood and steel, and the steel is structural support. And as long as it's more wood than steel and the value is greater, then you're allowed to do that because overall the steel is used as a component of, it's part of the product, but it's not the final product. The product is itself its own product. So if it's
So,
cosmetics, cosmetics is the product. The steel is obviously where it's contained in, or the aluminum. And at that point, you just declare it as a cosmetic. And you don't even refer to the packaging.
okay. So Jennifer's responded, interesting. Our broker indicated packaging for cosmetics specifically must be declared.
That may be, like I said, you'd have to look at the actual rulings
Yeah,
because sometimes there's many different case rulings.
yeah.
I just wanted
Sometimes
to
they're very
just throw it out
specific.
just in case.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lee. Much
Yeah.
appreciated. Jennifer, thank you for the questions in the comments. We're about 8 minutes after. I guess Sam, do you want to take another question or two, or oh, you're on mute.
I'm happy to take more questions. I understand we've gone over time, so
Yeah.
but if people do want to ask questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer them.
Great. Are there any additional questions, guys? Hopefully it's a great presentation. There's a lot of information thrown in. Just so everybody knows, we've recorded the session. We'll be posting on Sam's YouTube channel. You can go back and check the presentation Sam did last year as well. Before a lot of this started, we had we did a session for the chapter's members. You may want to view that. I'll include that link in the email that I send out. We'll send you a copy of the presentation as well as a copy of the video for your reference. As well, you have Dr. Roscoe's contact details. You can always check him out on his LinkedIn as well. Connect with him, and as well follow up on the YouTube channel. So I think we have one here. Are we okay with sharing this with brands,
like with clients?
with clients? Yeah,
I'm fine with it, Jennifer.
if it's posted on YouTube,
Publicly accessible.
it's
Yeah,
It's
everybody
public.
polite to
find it.
ask. It's
Yeah.
polite to ask.
No, it's great. We guys, we rarely record sessions, and we've made exceptions for this, right? Because we find there's a lot of value in this, and this is something that you'll have reference for uh, later as well. So we'll be
I'm just trying
posting
to
this.
add ammunition to my recommendation to my clients that they run these sort of stress tests for themselves. That, it's not just my voice. This is a chorus of voices within our industry suggesting recommending very strongly they run these scenarios.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, hopefully we'll be doing another one in a few more months. We'll see how things go. Hopefully, it's not an overly negative impact for everybody on this call, but
Yeah.
we're in for a trying next couple of years, right? So, anyway, Sam, do you have any closing comments before we close off, or we all
No,
good?
I just say it's so great to have so many of you here. I am affiliated with the ASCM and will continue to do these types of events. And if any other companies are interested in reaching out to me directly, I'm happy to work with businesses as well in a sort of consulting type of format to deal with risk planning, supply chain management questions, et cetera. So just reach out, get in touch. Happy to have a chat with businesses directly.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And again, you'll be getting some emails from us most likely within the next day. Thanks, everybody, for attending. Enjoy your lunch, and we will see you soon.